Hi there, you are listening to Incorruptible Massachusetts. Our goal is to help people understand state politics. So we investigate why it is so broken. We imagine what we could have here in our lives if we fixed it, and we report on how you can get involved. And today we have another special guest, super excited about this conversation about higher ed funding. But first, I will let our inimitable regulars introduce themselves. Jonathan Cohn.
Jonathan Cohn. I'm in Boston, although I'm currently in Cambridge right now. But progressive activist who's been involved in issuing electoral campaigns here in Massachusetts for the past 8 years.
And Jordan Berg Powers.
Jordan Berg Powers. I use he, him. I'm here from Worcester, and I have 13 years experience in Massachusetts politics. Although it feels much longer.
Feels longer.
Feels much longer.
And I am Anna Callahan, ran for state rep and involved in other state politics things. And she, her is what I go by. And we are excited to introduce Timmy Sullivan, who works with Phenom. And Timmy, if you would just introduce yourself and a little bit about Phenom and what you do.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Timmy Sullivan. He, him, his. I am located in the Pioneer Valley, where I've lived for 5 years in this beautiful stretch of Western Massachusetts. And I'm the executive director with Phenom, which is the public higher education network of Massachusetts. Phenom has been a real leader in higher ed conversations for the better part of like a decade and a half. In Massachusetts, we bring together stakeholders, and we're founded by stakeholders in public higher education. So that's students, faculty, workers, community members, really anyone who cares about guaranteeing everyone in the state's right to a public education. And we understand public education to include our public higher education system. So we've done a lot of work over that time in sort of shaping the conversation in the state, advancing some pieces of legislation that will increase folks' access to higher ed, and are really excited to be joining you all and bringing this conversation to the table.
Great. I want just, for 1 or 2 sentences from Jordan and from Jonathan about like, how do you think we're doing in Massachusetts around higher education?
It is like our public education system. We underfund it. We promise voters, elected officials promise voters that they care about our kids, but we fund it like it's one of our least, I don't say least, but it's one of the many priorities we don't really put our efforts into. We have the ability to have a world-class system. We certainly have the wealth to have a world-class system. And I would argue it's the engine for which Massachusetts, economy, but more importantly, I would say the things that attract people to the state is our education system, and we don't fund it like it is.
Jonathan?
Basically, I'm ditto to what Jordan said, mainly that particularly over the past 2 decades, Massachusetts has done a lot of disinvesting from public higher education, and if the costs are largely the same, which in some ways they have probably gone up, but if they're largely the same and the state's money comes away, somebody has to pay, and that's increasingly becoming students.
Yeah, I mean, with the huge conversation nationally around student debt, around this unbelievable amount of student debt that we have, and how crushing it is for younger people, but increasingly not even young people. There are people who are retiring now, and they still haven't paid off their student debt from 20 years ago. The conversations around canceling student debt have appeared to sort of collapsed at the national level. Timmy, I loved what you said about student debt and its relationship to state legislatures funding higher education.
Yeah, for sure. So it's really incredible to see this large national conversation about canceling student debt, this like bottom up sort of stimulus, which of course we at Phenom support because it will put money back in people's pockets, which now more than ever is needed. This is an enormous like financial crisis that is going to burst at some point. We have like $1.7 trillion of student debt, like 44 million Americans burdened with this. And there's also really a moral argument here of, should there be such a thing as student debt? The fact that term exists is ridiculous that we accept something as such. But what I try to remind folks of when we're having this national conversation is that sure, Joe Biden can, with the stroke of a pen, cancel our debts, but that ticker is going to start right over again if there is not robust reinvestment in our public education system. Folks are still going to accrue student debt for being enrolled in education. So it's really important, while we're having this national conversation about canceling the debt, to remember that locally our debts are manufactured, that our state legislatures, in the context of Massachusetts, the Massachusetts state legislature is the manufacturer of our student debts here. And this crisis of student debt is actually really acutely felt for us here in Massachusetts. We, as Jordan and Jonathan had mentioned, over the last 2 decades have severely disinvested public money from public schooling, such to the extent that in 2004, Massachusetts had the second lowest average student debt total in the entire country. We ranked 49th for average student debt. 16.
That's a good rate, though.
No, that's a good rate. We're at the bottom. We are like nationally ranking second lowest for debts. But in 16 years, we accelerated to have the fastest growing student debt average and now are the 10th highest. So we've jumped from 49 to 10th in a matter of 16 short years because of state disinvestment. Now, 3 in every 4 public school graduates in Massachusetts has student debt. And actually, diverging from national trends, we have a public college debt problem in Massachusetts because we have more students graduating from public colleges into student debt. So more public graduates have debt than private graduates in Massachusetts. And the raw numbers of student debt totals for public graduates is almost on par with what private graduates have for debt totals. So the fact that student debt in Massachusetts is disproportionately a public college problem should snap us awake to the reality that we have strayed so far from resembling anything close to a public school system.
That's crazy when we've got MIT, Harvard. I mean, we have the best schools in the country or in the world. And to think, private schools, and to think that our public school debt is approaching that is just, that's totally crazy.
Just quick point that I think is an interesting thing just for perspective on this is that, Timmy, you were talking about 2004 as well as when we're talking over the past 2 decades, as well to think of somebody who's just about to head into the UMass system this fall, what that picture was like for investment in debt when they were born versus when they go to college, and how much that has changed.
Yeah, so for when a student who's about to enroll in the UMass system was born, they would be paying, well, actually, and now I want to figure out the math. Right now, they're paying about double what they would have been paying if they enrolled when they were born. That's an easier way for me to calculate the figure in my brain. So over
they should have enrolled as babies.
They should have enrolled as babies. Like over the span of their lifetime of incoming freshmen, what they're expected to contribute personally out of pocket, and more often than not with debt financing, because we can't afford to pay out of pocket tens of thousands of dollars every year. Students are expected to pay double. And what has really caused that is a disinvestment trend from the state legislature. As money is being pulled out of our public school system, our public schools need to figure out where the money is going to come from. And one of those strategies, famously devised by Reagan a couple decades ago when he was the governor of California, was to have students and families be the financiers of a public education, which effectively privatizes our whole system of public education. More than half of the budget for a UMass system is coming from students paying for it, not from the legislature. So we have a public system in name only, but one that is majority privately financed. And this is why we have such an incredible debt burden as well, because it is unconscionable to be asking people to pay this much money for what is a public education every year. You cannot work a part-time job. Some students are working multiple jobs and they're still not able to finance their education. We have students who are working multiple jobs and skipping meals, and they're still going into debt financing for their education. We have an absolute crisis in higher ed, and this is all because of state disinvestment. And it can be solved so easily with state reinvestment of just putting public financing back into our public goods.
And, just to I think put the finer point on it. So I grew up, a little bit before when I was born, right? Reagan is president. I guess he's president. And, but first into his term, beginning into it. And you could, a lot of the times older folks, they'll say oh, I paid for it, but it was even room and board. The average cost was $7,000. It was $42,000 when I graduated from college, right? It's just not even, I think it's hard for people to really understand that that's not a little bit of money, right? $120,000 versus, $28,000 is a lot of difference. That's a house in between. That's a lifetime, especially when you accrue interest, which is the other part of it. A lot of them didn't. They didn't pay, they didn't accrue interest on those loans. They paid those loans outright or with minimal interest, but were put into a private marketplace where those interest rates very often the government has a floor, not a ceiling really. And so there's a lot of taking money off the top from private corporations. So it's just they de-invest and then they literally take the money out of my pocket and give it to investors and give it to people who are already rich and make them even richer through servicing something that should not have cost a house, right? And that was when I was in, and I'm old, right? Compared to, I'm a geriatric millennial, right? I am an old millennial. There are people who, there are young people going into the college system who wish that they pay what I paid.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying with respect to my mom's story, which is one that I tell sometimes, because you can see the disparity just within one generation, right? And my mom had me while she was young too. So there's not even a whole lot of difference here, generationally between her and I, but she went to UMass Boston in the early 90s. And my mom does not have student debt. Okay, my mom was the first in her entire family to go to college, from a low-income family, a single mother, raising a son, and got the opportunity to be this first-gen low-income single mother student at UMass Boston, and become a nurse and help our family, have economic mobility, provide the opportunity for her 4 sons to go on and get college educations. And we have student debt, but this was an opportunity that my mom had because at that time, the state invested in students and they made it possible for people like my mom to go and get an education. And I'm struck with the fact that now, if my mom was just in my situation, only 2 decades later, she probably would not have gone on to be able to get the degree that she did, or if she was able to, it probably would have taken her a lot longer. She would still be paying it off. She would have to be working multiple jobs and have either debts to banks and the government or interpersonal debts, which is another way that some folks finance this, right? Within their families, they're borrowing money. So even the student debt figure that we see nationally of $1.7 trillion, what is hidden in some of that is these interpersonal debts that people are taking on. So it's really terrifying, that this has happened so quickly, and that we also accept this with such complacency as sort of a new normal.
Yeah, I know. I love the way that you sort of paint this as a problem of the state legislatures. The whole existence of student debt for public college is something that these state legislatures and our state legislature have created. And I heard this amazing story from you that I would love to highlight, which is that the Cherish Act, and I'd love for you to tell you exactly what that act would have done. It got killed in a committee where almost 2/3 of the members of the committee were co-sponsors of the bill, official co-sponsors of the bill. And I would love to hear that story from you.
Yeah, so this is 2 years ago in 2019. So in that legislative session, the Cherish Act, which is a bill that addresses one part of the problem of funding with higher education. So it will basically revert the state spending on public higher education back to the 2001 per pupil spending. And so 2001 is sort of the year that we all are using as when the crisis of disinvestment really started. So this bill will revert us back to 2001 per pupil spending figures into the public higher education system. And in 2019, in the committee, the higher ed committee, which was presiding over the Cherish Act, 11 out of the 17 committee members, so 64%, basically 2/3, but nonetheless a majority of the committee were co-sponsors of this bill, yet it did not leave the committee. It stayed for the session in the committee, and this is still a piece of legislation that we're holding now in this session, public hearing about, having to do co-sponsorship drives, convince legislators that this is something that's needed.
And how useful is that co-sponsorship drive?
Yeah, well,
then
that's
you get the co-sponsors, and then they won't get it out of committee.
Exactly.
I was to say, like, expecting that a majority support should mean something, as well as expecting that people who are co-sponsoring your bill should actually do something for it. What do you think this place is?
So that's quite, like, demoralizing to see that we can have, nominally a majority of folks presiding over a piece of legislation purport to care about it, but then actually not do the work that moves it forward.
So what do legislators say when you guys are there asking? Do you hear a similar story from all these legislators when you're asking for more money for higher ed? What do you hear?
So it really depends. There are some legislators who totally get it. We have like real champions. So I want to shout out Representative Higgins and Senator Eldridge, who are, filing and really championing a piece of legislation near and dear to Phenom, which is the Debt-Free Future Act, or an act to guarantee debt-free public higher education, which is H1339. This would make public higher education free for all residents of the Commonwealth and give extra grant money to low-income students. So this is incredible. And if we are able to pass a bill like the Debt-Free Future Act, we can see Massachusetts in the headlines, not for having the fastest growing totals of student debt, but for being the first state in the country to guarantee public education as a right to students in this way. So that's really important. And I think we owe it to sort of the champions of this issue who are doing a lot of work to give them that credit. Alternatively, we have a couple of other narratives that legislators love to throw at us. One of them is the classic, how do you pay for it? Of which we have several proposals, that could fund it. We have progressive income tax, the millionaire's tax, fair share amendment, which some of the money could go and be used for this. Representative Higgins has also filed an endowment tax bill, which for private colleges that have endowments over $1 billion, the dollars over 1 billion, so your billionth and first dollar gets taxed at 2.5%. Incredible on these institutions such as Harvard that have $40 billion endowments, which grew by $1 billion over the course of the pandemic while students were dropping out of college, taking on debt totals, debt financing, going into hunger and being evicted. And Harvard is profiting $1 billion. It would tax this sort of money to be able to fully subsidize. Like this tax would more than cover what we need to make tuition free in Massachusetts, which is phenomenal. You get some legislators also who, tell us that our state systems have too much money already, which is hard to hear as a student debtor myself, previously as a public college student, because it is the disinvestment of the legislature that has produced the conditions by which students, have to go into debt. So to have these sort of false narratives that look at the increasing bureaucratization of public higher ed, hurts, when we know that students are having to take on debt totals, and we know that faculty are suffering layoffs. They're not afforded tenure track opportunities, the adjunctification and underpaying and over-reliance on grad students, and, is really a hard reality to par with what legislators are pretending is the reality for state financing of public schools.
Yeah, I just want to talk about the like Uberification and the way in which, because I think the other side of this that people miss, but I see, and I really didn't understand till I saw it with my wife. So my wife ran a nonprofit. She has a doctorate in education, and she, you know, she started to move towards teaching, and she teaches partially at private and partially at public. If she were to, you know, she does not have a track towards tenure. That thing that we think of, that sort of, you know, they often say like, oh, all these professors, all these things. Universities are not doing that anymore. They aren't giving people opportunities to have a a regular job where it pays you regularly and you're on track to having some security. What they're going towards are models where they bring in people who are themselves burdened by debt that they will never pay. Right, we will die with my wife's student loan debt. We will never pay off the student loan debt, and she is paid so little as an adjunct. It would take her 6 classes if she had a course load of 6 classes every semester, and in the summer, the 2 summer course loads, 6 classes. That's what it would take to get my pay. And I am underpaid, right? Like, it's not, as a nonprofit person, and I don't have a doctorate, right? So there is, you know, that course load would be insane. And then on top of that, even if she wanted to do it, universities don't promise classes. They don't promise, right? It's like Uber. You get what you know, what somebody else gives you, but, you know, graces with you. You have to, you know, you're at the mercy of an employer who can just not give you a class if they don't like you or not bring you back. And then you yourself will be hungry, will be falling into you know, economic despair. We don't know what my wife will be teaching this summer, if she gets to teach at all, let alone next fall, where her classes are up in the air because of mismanagement by administrators. So, you know, that's sort of like economic, you know, unsure of where they are, what's going. That's also a part of the disinvestment, right? It's not just that students are suffering, which they are. Faculty are also suffering in these things. You know, it's no longer the days where being a professor is this great upper middle class job. It is for some. It is for people who get into tenure. It is for some who are older than us, right, who got on this track when that was still available. But it is less and less so every year, and future generations can be less and less so. And so, you know, that's really the other piece that's terrible about this whole system, is just the way it treats people, faculty. And, you know, and then in the other side of it, and again, students also suffer in that process. They'll ask my wife, oh, when is your class? And she'll say, I don't know. They'll say, can I take your class? She'll say, I don't know. Right. So that ability to build and mentor relationships is also in the air by this process.
Just quickly to build on that, you can see the kind of underlying kind of ideological, philosophic, socioeconomic connection or political economic connection between viewing your staff as like, quote, independent contractors, so to speak, as which the adjunctification is doing, as well as viewing the student body as like consumers or users to be charged like the user fee for a public good. And kind of both have kind of reflective of broader trends in the economy. If you have that kind of neoliberalization of higher education, where it's not viewed as something that we collectively invest in, but is viewed as a kind of as a corporation.
And on that point, Jonathan, something that the UMass Amherst campus witnessed and students were protesting a month ago or so was that the Board of Trustees had just voted to raise tuition on international students for UMass Amherst tuition, and did so while also promoting that tuition for in-state and out-of-state students didn't go up, and really patting themselves on the back for that. But what you have here is that the increases to the tuition for international students are being used to offset what would have been fee increases for in-state and out-of-state students. So we have this sort of game that is going on of how to have students be the offsetters of cost between each other, when really what we should be looking for financing is just from the state legislature. But instead we are creating, like you're saying, all of these games out of who can be consumers, what are revenue streams that we can get, this really privatized model of consumption and delivery versus what this ought to be, which is just learning.
And it's, I just want to go quick, you create a managerial class, right? So you create this class of people who, again, are political appointees. They're not people with expertise. They're not people who got doctorates at these universities. These are people who happen to know the right people. And then they not only bloat their own salaries, they bloat the managerial staff underneath them, which is loyal, which grows, which sort of, comes at a cost. So you get this system in place where then they go back to the legislators and say like, yeah, just make those students and those professors, we'll figure out how to make it. They are become a part of the like liberalization, the way in which our universities become a part of that model, right? The same way Uber or Grubhub or all of these things extract their dollars from regular workers, from the people who do the hard work, from the small businesses that they literally steal money from, and extract it out of the system and put it towards the top. So that same system is happening in our public education system, and it does not need to be this way. It does not need to be this way.
It does not. I firmly believe that the electorate in Massachusetts is in favor of, lowering this ridiculous student debt that we have here in Massachusetts and across the country. This is not a controversial issue. This is not an issue that the people aren't behind. And yet our state legislature can't seem to make it happen. So I just want to paint a little picture here of like, what could we have? We could be the first state, as you mentioned, Timmy, to really guarantee higher education for all of our residents, which, how many countries in Europe and other places in the world already do this and have done it for decades? We could be that domino causing all the other states to do something similar. Any other ideas of what we could really have here in Massachusetts?
I mean, sadly, Europe is going the direction of, or at least England is going the direction of America. But when I got my master's degree in England for $3,000 and I applied abroad because I didn't want to take on more student debt in America. So as a foreign student, if I were a student there, I would have gotten it for free, but I paid an international fee of the equivalent of $30,000 to get my master's degree in London. Imagine that. Imagine if we went back to that, the 70s, the 60s, where like higher education for international students accrued a small fee, right? And everyone else was free. That should be our model. It's critical to where we're going. It's critical to the sort of society we're building. And there's no reason it need not be available for everyone. We have the wealth in this state.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody. This was really amazing. And Timmy, final last words. Is there anything that people can do to help with the legislation you're currently pushing?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost is to get in touch with your state legislators. Find out who is your state rep, and your state senator, Phenom, is asking you to encourage them to publicly commit to vote yes on the Debt-Free Future Act. That's House Bill 1339. This is a crucial step. The other way is to get in touch with Phenom directly. We are on social media, Twitter and Instagram at MassPhenom, MassPhenom. You can reach out to me, Timmy, at phenomonline.org, our website, phenomonline.org. But being involved is critical. We've talked a lot about disinvestment here, and what we mean by disinvestment is austerity. Ruth Wilson Gilmore has this phenomenal way of characterizing austerity as public abandonment or organized abandonment. And what's really, helpful in that characterization, I think, is that it is only possible for the state legislature to abandon us if we are not actively holding their feet to the fire, if we are not paying attention and are organized. Because if we are going to stand up and say, absolutely the hell not, then it is impossible politically for them to disinvest from what is ours. So we really need you all, everyone who is listening to this, and your neighbor, go knock on their door to be a part of this reinvestment and this collective vision for what we can have in Massachusetts.
Fantastic. Excellent last words. Thank you so much. We'll see everybody next week.